His followers see their leader broken. Do nothing. People will say, you've been no friend to Tiberius.
You gave in to him! You could have stopped him!
There's no talking with these people, don't you see that? The things they believe. I will not be undermined in Rome.
You've done God's work.
Let's hope other people see that.
Oh!
No one came for me. You said you wanted nothing to do with this. You have put an innocent man to death.
Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 75, and today we're going to be talking about BBC's The Passion. It's another snow day here in North Carolina at the time of recording, and in my Jesus in Film course we'd reached the stage of this semester where we were going to talk about The Passion, which is a production of the BBC made in 2008, and it followed in a way hot on the heels of Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ in 2004, which we looked at in my class on Tuesday. The Passion, though, is rather different from The Passion of the Christ in all sorts of ways, and we'll come on to that in due course. Lots of people aren't familiar with the BBC production though, so here's a few details about it. It's produced by Nigel Stafford Clark, who was the producer of Bleak House, one of the most brilliant productions of a Dickens of a Dickens novel. I strongly recommend you look that out if you haven't already seen it. It was commissioned by Jane Tranter, who was associated with the return of Doctor Who in 2005, and so is to be loved by all Whovians all over the world forever for bringing that programme back. It was directed by Michael Offer, somebody who has continued directing great TV. He's recently directed things like How to Get Away with Murder in the US, Person of Interest, which stars Jim Caviezel, who is Jesus in the Passion of the Christ, Homeland, all sorts of things Michael Offer's been involved with. And it was written by an Irish writer called Frank Deasy, and Frank Deasy's writing really is, in many respects, the key to the success of this Jesus film. The BBC has made other biblical films in the past. I mean, there's a piece called Jesus of Nazareth from 1956, many years before the Franco Zeffirelli piece for ITV, and now very difficult to get hold of, sadly. And it had Paul of Tarsus, which starred Patrick Troughton, which they made in 1960. Patrick Troughton, the Second Doctor. I mean, that would also be wonderful to see. I would love to see Paul of Tarsus. Famously, it had Son of Man in 1969, which was written by Dennis Potter. And I think one of the things is that the BBC just has this reputation for doing great period drama, great costume drama, for really taking history seriously. So if anyone was going to do a really great version of the Passion story, who better to do it than the BBC? And the occasion for it is Easter. The BBC always likes to do something special at Easter, just as it likes to do something special at Christmas. And ideally, they want to do something that's connected with the Jesus story. They want to find a way of tackling the Jesus story in a fresh way. And they had the idea, as early as 2005, to start developing their own Passion drama. The idea being that they would strip it across Holy Week, perhaps in 5 or even 6 episodes, taking an episode a night leading up to a climax on Easter Day. And this is basically what they produced. They produced a mini-series, 3 hours worth of material. It was broadcast in 4 parts in the end. The first part, 60 minutes, the second part, 30 minutes, the third part, 60 minutes, and the fourth part, 30 minutes. And it was really a critical success. I remember Anthony Horowitz saying on one of those review programs that this was as close to perfect television as you can get, and lots of the reviewers just loved The Passion, and for good reason. I think it's a really superb piece of work. But I do have to confess an interest in it. This was one of the most wonderful things that happened in my short career so far, that In 2005, I was approached by Michael Wakelin, who at the time was the head of religion and ethics at the BBC, to ask if I would be interested in being the series advisor for this new thing on the Passion. He knew of my interest in Jesus films. He knew, of course, of my interest in historical Jesus because I'd worked with him on other productions, several other productions. So I could not have been more thrilled to have been asked. I could not have been more excited. And I would still say to this day, it's one of the most wonderful things in my career to have been involved in some way, even in a small way like this, with a Jesus film. To talk to the producer extensively, to talk to the writer, to look at scripts, to interact with them, to watch early cuts of the film, to answer odd little questions. It's just a wonderful privilege, and it's not something that I take at all lightly. I still glow with pride at having been asked to be involved in it. Anyway, enough of all of that. Let's get on to looking in a bit more detail at what happens in The Passion.
What authority did you have to throw out these honest merchants?
I'm honored by my audience. My authority comes from the one who sent me. One who was always with me.
How can someone send you and always be with you?
He sends me and never leaves me.
Children's riddles,
You mean this little one understands?
You don't?
It's true. But she isn't allowed inside the temple.
She's unclean, it's the law.
And her?
You know she's a sinner.
So she should be turned away from her father's house. Is that the love you show your own children? Can you really believe God loves his children less than you?
But let's get to the heart of The Passion, which is how Jesus is depicted in the piece. He's played by Joseph Maul, who plays Jesus quite differently, I think, from any other depiction of him. He is not standoffish. He's not distant. He really is the kind of Jesus that really enjoys a conversation with his disciples, listens to them, but he still has gravitas and authority. The way that Frank Deasy, the writer, put it is that he would love the idea of writing a line in the script that Jesus went outside for a cigarette. Jesus lit up a cigarette, because he liked the idea that Jesus was simply interacting with people in a normal, everyday kind of way. Deasy himself was not a fan of Gibson's Passion of the Christ, and although he admired Jesus of Nazareth, the Franco Zeffirelli series, very much, he did feel that Robert Powell's depiction was somehow different from the way that he wanted his Jesus to interact with other people in the story. He used all sorts of different ways of trying to make the dialogue real and lively and not too mannered and not too old-fashioned. One thing he did is he used newer translations, different translations. He looked at the Jewish New Testament in order to get different ideas. One thing that results from his use of the Jewish New Testament is that he always uses the translation Judeans rather than Jews in the story. And since I've already mentioned Passion of the Christ, we should probably take a look at ways in which this film contrasts with The Passion of the Christ. I think it does exercise a kind of influence on The Passion, but it's an influence that is largely negative. So there are all sorts of respects in which The Passion, the BBC Passion that is, distinguishes itself from the really popular big screen adaptation only a few years earlier on. One criticism, for example, of The Passion of the Christ is that Caiaphas, the high priest, just doesn't appear to have any real human emotions or any kind of sympathetic emotions. We can't really understand why Caiaphas is doing what he's doing in The Passion of the Christ. He seems to be doing it because the story demands that he does it, and he seems to be doing it because he's somehow evil, somehow nasty, somehow just doing this because he's bloody-minded and sadistic.
When I was sort of happy with Jesus as a character that was coming to life, I began to concentrate more on the opposing point of view, and I found myself becoming very sympathetic to Caiaphas, in the sense of his humanity, both dramatically, but I also feel theologically, it's far more rich to see Caiaphas as a flawed human being. He's not just trying to protect something very abstract like a social order or a theological hierarchy. He's trying to protect his family, he's trying to protect his child, his people. And that noble aspiration leads leaders into all sorts of disastrous situations. And the way that happens and the steps on that process, as the stages in that process, are all too human. It might have been Arthur Miller, but somebody has pointed out that tragedy isn't right against wrong, it's right against right.
In The Passion, in the BBC Passion, one of the things that Frank Deasy does is he gives Caiaphas a family. It's a great move. If you bear in mind that in The Passion of the Christ, Pilate has a wife, Claudia. I mean, Pilate's wife is mentioned in Matthew's Gospel in Matthew 27, and that's the impetus for giving Pilate a wife. But we also have a wife implied, at least, in the Gospels, because Caiaphas has a father-in-law, Annas. We have Caiaphas having a father-in-law, Annas. We have these characters mentioned in Josephus too. And Frank Deasy said, well, hold on a minute. So if he's a father-in-law, let's make him the father of Caiaphas's wife. And if we see Caiaphas's wife, then we get to understand what Caiaphas is like at home. So we see the domestic Caiaphas. We see him interacting with his wife. And what he does with his wife is that he has, she is pregnant and has other children. So you get to understand what it's like to see inside the life of a character like Caiaphas. This is like a really important departure from the way that things are done in The Passion of the Christ, and to me it's a very favourable difference between those two films. And he's played brilliantly, I think, by Ben Daniels, somebody who I loved in Law and Order UK, subsequent to The Passion. So Joseph of Arimathea becomes a major character again, just as he is earlier in Jesus of Nazareth, where he is played by James Mason. And one of the things about bringing Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus into any Jesus film is that you can have those deliberations in the Sanhedrin without making it just seem like everybody's ganging up on Jesus. What you have instead is an intelligent, gripping, really difficult discussion between different characters, and so you don't run the risk of making the whole thing seem terribly anti-Jewish. So introducing Joseph of Arimathea and making him a really compassionate and fascinating character is a great move in The Passion of the Christ. At the same time, what the film does is it tries to understand the politics of the time. I remember talking to Frank Deasy at some length about the first century politics, about the kind of realities of, and I remember talking to him about the relationship between Pilate and Caiaphas and looking at the way that he was going to write those. I remember him very much enjoying E.P. Sanders's work. He read The Historical Figure of Jesus by Sanders and found that extremely helpful in his conceptualizing of what Jerusalem would have been like. As a result, it really doesn't engage in lots of the standard cliches of Jesus films and of stuff about Christian origins. There's one scene in particular, for example, where we get Caiaphas and Pilate meeting and Pilate giving up to the high priest his high priestly vestments. And it's a scene which is derived really from Josephus. And I talked to Frank Deasy about that and suggested that it might be a way of getting to the complex political relationship between the two men.
Dearest Caiaphas.
Prefect.
You don't have to come all the way up here. My men will come down to the temple.
I'd like to welcome you, Prefect.
Of course you do.
But if you would allow me to keep my robes in the temple...
Come. Who grants you authority in your temple?
My authority comes from God.
But on this earth, who, for example, allows you to keep Roman coins out of the temple? Exactly. And because it's clear, Rome's rule in Judea is light.
No one wants that to change.
Tiberius certainly doesn't. Peace in Judea is our emperor's dearest wish.
And Another thing that the film does rather well is it explores the role of Judas in a very different way from the way that you see him in other Jesus films. In things like The Passion of the Christ, Judas really becomes an almost demonic figure. He's pursued to death by people who look like little kind of demons. It's one of the most unpleasant scenes in the film where little Jewish boys sort of morph into demons who chase and pursue Judas. And we don't really understand why Judas is doing what he's doing in The Passion of the Christ. When we come to the Passion, though, he's made a young man, a young naive man who is almost in awe of Caiaphas and the leadership in Jerusalem. And so he's somebody who the viewer has some sympathy with, because you're thinking, oh, Judas, don't do it, you know. And Jesus himself is really emotional about what he knows Judas is going to do. A huge contrast as well with The Passion of the Christ is the question of violence. Now, of course, in something like the Passion, which was shown pre-Watershed on the BBC, you can't have really graphic violence. But I wonder, when I watch The Passion, whether in fact not showing so much of the violence is more helpful. That the story is just as emotional, just as gripping if you don't see all of that kind of blood and gore. There's something rather more emotional about not seeing it and having it implied and seeing characters' reactions to it. There's a scene where Mary runs to the cross, Mary the mother of Jesus, played by Penelope Wilton. She runs to the cross. Wonderful, incidentally, having Penelope Wilton in the piece. Others might know her as Harriet Jones from Doctor Who, or also from her key role in Downton Abbey, but she plays Mary the mother of Jesus in this, and again does it very compellingly. Perhaps one of the other major contrasts between this film and The Passion of the Christ is the way that it tells the resurrection story. The Passion of the Christ has a remarkably short resurrection piece where Jesus is inside the tomb and the viewer is inside the tomb with him. The screen fades to black after Jesus' death. You almost wonder if the credits are about to come up, and then you realise you're inside the tomb and the stone's rolling away. I do think it's quite a compelling piece of Mel Gibson's film. And in fact, I wish he'd made more of that resurrection scene, because it's quite a brilliant and an almost bizarre idea to see the resurrection from Jesus' perspective. But what The Passion does is something which I think is even more risky and even more challenging than anything that I've seen elsewhere, which is you wonder with the disciples whether you are actually seeing Jesus or not.
It wasn't him, but it was. It felt like Jesus.
I believe what you say. I believe you saw something.
And I actually don't want to spoil this for the viewer who hasn't seen The Passion yet, because I think it's quite powerful. I remember getting the phone call from Nigel Stafford Clark, the producer, when he told me the news that they were going to film or planning to film or script the resurrection story differently from the way that it's normally scripted. Again, I'm trying not to say too much here. And he wondered whether I thought that it would be controversial or not. And my feeling was, well, potentially it might be controversial, but I thought it probably wouldn't, because what they do is true to the gospel story, in that they're not really sure if they're seeing Jesus or not. Remember that when Mary Magdalene in John's Gospel first sees Jesus, she doesn't recognize him. She thinks he's the gardener. When the two men on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24 meet with Jesus, they don't recognize him. And it's always been difficult to do that in drama, because as the viewer, we can tell it's Jesus. I mean, you can put a kind of great big hood on, but is it really compelling as drama when you just have Jesus in a big hood walking along? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So the way that it's done in The Passion, I think, is quite exciting, actually, very moving, very dramatic. There's one other thing that I do want to mention that fills me with joy when I think back to The Passion, And it's something, again, that I remember talking at some length to Nigel Stafford Clark and Frank Deasy about, which is all of those Jesus films, all of those years, have always made Mary Magdalene a prostitute. A repentant prostitute, yes, but always a prostitute. And as lots of New Testament scholars have said, you can't really go around just taking a character, conflating her with other characters, and then turning her into a prostitute when there's no textual warrant to do that. And I said, wouldn't it be kind of amazing if this could be one of the first productions in which Mary Magdalene is not a prostitute? I mean, it would be something where this would distinguish itself from others. I kind of suspected that all along, however much earlier scripts didn't have her as a prostitute, that eventually, that element would come back into the production. I mean, in the Gospel of John film, the Visual Bible Gospel of John, it's interesting that Mary Magdalene is not depicted as a prostitute in the script, but no one told the costume designer, and the costume designer worked on the whole premise that Mary Magdalene began as a prostitute and repented and changed. This doesn't do that, and Paloma Biza, who plays Mary Magdalene, plays her simply as one of Jesus's disciples, a kind of right-hand woman to Jesus. It's a very gentle depiction. It shows a woman who is faithful to Jesus, who follows Jesus, who's there at his right hand, but doesn't have this checkered background. And I think it really works.
Can you not talk to him?
Jesus believes this is his destiny.
And you?
I believe in him.
It's easy to believe when you're young. He'll need you.
There's a curious sort of sideline to this, which is that Frank Deasy did feel that the story did require a repentant prostitute, and because Mary wasn't going to be that person, and because this was telling a story of the Passion, he was able to introduce a repentant prostitute into the narrative as part of the Passion. So he introduces the character Mina, who also then follows with Jesus. I think that kind of works, good for old Mina. Well, that's a little sketch of a few things that I rather liked about the Passion. I must admit, I have so much that I want to say about this that I might actually sit down and write a little bit more about this in due course, and perhaps I'll return to it on the NT Pod again in due course. Before finishing, though, I do want to mention a rather sad note, which is that Frank Deasy died a year after the production of The Passion, after it came on television. So it was on TV in the UK in 2008, and Frank died in 2009 of liver cancer complication that came from liver cancer. I remember talking to him the day before he went for his operation. Absolutely tragic death, really, to die so young and to be such a great talent. He was a really brilliant man, and also a very lovely man. I loved talking to him about this, and it's something that I will always feel hugely privileged to have been involved with, even in that small way. And therefore I'd like to dedicate this podcast to his memory with a great deal of affection. Well, thanks for listening to this latest episode of the NT Pod. It's always great to have your company. You can find me on the web at podacre.blogspot.com, and the podcast is on iTunes, Stitcher, Duke University's iTunes U. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Goodacre, and don't forget that I've got a Facebook page too. Just look for NT Pod. Thanks again for listening. Great to have your company. I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
So the Gospels become a meditation really on humanity and suffering and death, and I became very interested in opening them up to find a drama within that was accessible, that has a universal accessibility, whether you are a person of faith who believes in Jesus as the Son of God, whether you see him as a prophet, or simply as a first century Palestinian Jew who believed he had a God-given mission.